Well, hello and welcome to week 12. This is the second recording of the material for translational research. Also, week 12 will be the start of our quantitative presentations. Let me share my screen with you so you can see what I'm looking at. Share. All right. Okay, I think you should see it. Here's the week under the course content, and tells you the dates and everything. So those 2 weeks, week 12 and 13, starting on 4/6, will focus on translational research, and also we'll be doing over 2 weeks our presentations. Even though the material for translation research is self-study and we have the entire content here, we will meet on Thursday. That would be the 9th, I think. Anyway, it would be the same time we usually meet on Thursday. So 1 p.m. we'll be able to do half of the presentations, and then the following Thursday we'll do the same. Basically, for those 2 weeks and the 2 weeks after, we will be doing all presentations, starting with the quantitative and then the evidence-based paper. So for this week, we have chapter 15 in the book. I hope you have a chance to read it, because this will make a lot more sense. And also strongly recommended, I would read the Fleming et al. As an example of applying or explaining the role of translational research, even though it's not specifically one clinical problem, but this is to address some of the disparities in care and at a larger, more of a public health scale. So the term translational research is kind of recent, especially after all the information revolution, if you will, all that information out there, all the scholarship and research activities, and how to facilitate reaching or bringing that new ideas, new knowledge into practice. There's a summary here or a fact sheet from the NIH where you can look at it. It tells you facts about clinical translational centers, and there's the purpose of this program, the goals, and etc., and other opportunities and contact information here as well. This would be very good information to know. And also the end of week 12, you'll have assignments due, the bibliography, the second assignment in your evidence-based paper, and also the week following that would be the individual problem solving or problem analysis and SMART objectives. This is an individual one. You can check it out, and it's due the week after that. So let's just dig in and see what this thing is all about and start going. So as a starter, translational research. What is it? What is meant with it, and why we're using it, and how we can capitalize on it? To start, it's the how to move basic research from the lab to practice area. Maybe if you remember from my last talk, the amount of time it used to take was about 15-20 years to move evidence from research into practice, and that's a very, very long time. And I think there isn't a better time to gain the or use the advantages of translational research than today, as we're dealing with a pandemic, because things are moving really fast. And if you have evidence of something that's useful, something that works, you have research behind it to support it, it's very imperative that we use it. And on the other hand, if you have something that is not useful, something that could harm individuals or communities, we avoid it. There is news every day about studies coming up, and these things are, to a large extent, a result of translational research, because those are done in large biomedical centers, and they are shared widely around the world, and people learn from each other right away. They share results, they share trials, etc. So translational research, basically whatever is out there, you find there are ways, very complicated, very obscure methods that uses big data, and we'll see some of those centers. We have 2 of them in Minnesota. We'll talk about those later. They use all that data to try to find better ways to serve, the patient and also the big population. The phases of translational research are 2 phases mainly. T1 is translational 1, focuses on basic research. And we know from our study before, basic research is done in the lab. It doesn't have to have a clinical focus, doesn't have to have a population, if you will, that you're studying. You could be doing, lab, like a chemistry experiment, or experiments on genes and fruit flies, or something that has no direct impact on humans. But also in the second, if you find something promising, and then the second phase would be focusing it on applied research to bring it to bedside, basically. So in other words, it's moving research from the bench to the bedside. And that's really essential to what research is all about. In this case, with translational research, it's done in a much more complex way, and it's done in a much faster and more expedient way to send new information out and try to get the most out of it. As you can see here, there are interactions between basic research and then the population or patient-oriented research. These are some examples of centers or hubs, if you will, the CTSA, the Clinical and Translational Science Awards. If you look back at the NIH handout, you'll see some more details, what constitutes these programs. And as you can see, they're spread around the United States. And in Minnesota, we have 2 of them, one in Minneapolis at the University of Minnesota, and one in Rochester at Mayo. And you can see these are 2 big medical or academic health centers, and they use clinical data from these facilities and try to find ways to utilize that data to improve services. What does the translational research focus on? You have a wide range of things. Basic research, for example, it's preclinical. You might also consider human trials, and also establishes foundation for the next phase. When you get those results or outcomes from basic, you move to applied research, where it can be adopted, can be implemented, and it provides guidelines for either patient or community to to use that and get the best out of it. And both aspects, obviously, basic and applied, are crucial and necessary. In advancing knowledge, you cannot just do bedside research or improvement without having background or a foundation in basic research, because they both complement each other. In the clinical area, you might have a question or a problem that you can only solve in the lab first and then bring it back. In the lab, you might discover something new, find a new relationship or a new interaction between two factors or two variables that can be useful in the clinical area, and so on. Don't get confused when you start reading about logic models. I know there's a lot of terms there, lots of terminologies, but these are basically all point at one thing. Those are roadmaps or concept maps that help us plan, implement, and evaluate. If you read in the book and get confused, try not to. Just think of those. There are a bunch of examples there, and a variety of different ways of thinking, and there isn't one better than the other. And then, if one makes more sense to you, you can use that as your own, but we're not going to test you on what is the difference between program theory or logical framework. These are all roadmaps, ways for planning any translational research projects. And the different hubs around the US would probably adopt different things. So it depends on the scientists or researchers who are working, and they adopt these ways to think of planning and implementing and evaluating different projects to get their work done on a daily basis. Sometimes they probably won't even think about what we're doing because it's already ingrained into the process they're working on. The Fleming article that you have has this model. There are two models in there. This is the simplest and easiest to understand. And as I mentioned, this article shows the role of translational research into helping with removing or reducing health disparities in different communities. And basically, the first step here is to determine the cause or the problem or the research questions that lead to disparities. Here you find the interventions. So first, the first problem, it applies to biomedical, basic behavioral, social science research. Then you bring it to clinical research, or you can do trials, you can do, depending on what questions you have. And then detecting disparities in incidence or prevalence, that, it's a full circle, I believe starts from here, detecting the problem, then determining what causes it, and then testing interventions, and so on and so forth. So it's another example. It's explained better in the article. So when you read it, it'll make more sense. This is just another example of logic models. We'll talk a little bit about those definitions later, but basically, you're put a plan where you decide on your resources, activities, participation, outcomes, and for example, here under resources, what we invest, how much money we need to put into it, and what do we put into this project. And then activities, exactly what are the steps that we're going to do it. Participation, who's going to do that? And you put people in place where everyone would know their role and what they're doing, and give them specific tasks and objectives to achieve. And then under outcome, you have short-term, long-term outcomes, as well as impact. We'll talk a little bit about impact research, and it's in your SMART objectives assignment also to include an impact statement in there. So impact research basically is, what is the outcome? What is the result that has influence or consequence on whatever the problem that you're studying. So it's the consequence or influence that results from using those ways of thinking about a problem, like the logic models, and how translation research makes a difference in the health and populations in societies. So the impact statement or impact research is it measures or it estimates how much it would improve the health of individuals and or communities. Imagine if we're doing impact research on COVID-19, and an impact statement would say, if we follow these evidence-based measures or these interventions, it would save this many people from dying, or save this many people from becoming severely ill or disabled. So it would give, it's a good thing to use when you're trying to apply for, say, a grant. You could include in your literature review or analysis that this research actually makes a difference in people's lives, and it would sell better for funding agency. And this is the context of translational research. As you can see, it goes from the individual, and then the interpersonal, organizational, community, and policy. That could be a local policy, state, or federal policy. It could also be national or international policies. If your research has application to humankind in general, like World Health Organization, United Nations, etc., you can benefit humanity from the research that you're doing. So it has a vast application spectrum here. These are some of the logic modeling that I was talking about. As I said, don't get hung up on those, but there are some different categories. First of all is the theory approach model, which is based in theory or change theory, and it gives you a justification for the development of a new program. You explain the reasoning behind it. For example, the outcome approach, it focuses on what the outcomes are, and it determines the connection between resources and activities. It employs short and long-term impact outcomes, and it focuses on evaluation. Some problems might lend themselves more to one or the other logic modeling, but in general, they are, as I mentioned, the roadmap. And there is an activities approach model, which concentrates on implementation and supervision of any project. For steps, usually when you design a research project or engage into it using translational research, is always starting with the problem. What is the problem and or the challenge? And then you come up with a goal statement, use if-then statements and to-do lists where it kind of constitutes your action plan. And that would eventually lead to you to think of outcomes as something measurable and reflects change. And this is basically what I want you really to think about when we talk about the SMART objectives and the problem or challenge analysis. And this is an individual assignment. Normally in the class, if we had to meet in person, would have been a good group project, but things have changed and we have to adapt a little bit more. So with the problem challenge analysis, there's more This is the Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin extension, and it's more explained more in the book. But basically, it's like a nursing process model here, really. What is the problem? Why it's a problem? And for whom does it exist? Who is involved in the problem? Who has a stake in the problem? And what do research and experience say? So you base all your work on evidence. And what do we already know about the problem? There may or may not be enough information about a problem, but once you ask yourself these questions, it'll be easier to determine what are the objectives or goals that you want to reach, and that's what you're going to use with SMART objectives. So these objectives that you formulate will be better served, and your work is more valuable if you stick with the SMART acronym: specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and timed. As much as you can, keep your objectives specific. Try not to solve, the whole world problems at one time. Try to focus on your objective. In your assignment, just pick a clinical problem that you think of and determine one specific area you want to be working on. Measurable, try to make it as measurable as possible, meaning quantitative, meaning numbers, meaning using a specific tool. As we know, quantitative research and quantitative data lends itself better to measurement than qualitative, which can be less objective. Actions. So to achieve your goal for this SMART objective, what are you going to do? And action verbs to describe what you're going to do. Also make it realistic. As I said, you're not going to solve all problems related to, underage drinking or falls in the hospital or failure to thrive in children, for example. You just focus on something that's more achievable, more attainable. And lastly, timed. You want to put a time frame for your objective. So it depends on the problem. Some objectives are short term, some are long term. If you think about pain and you want to intervene for pain, an objective would be, I want to achieve a pain score for this patient to be between 2 and 3 within the next 2 hours, for example. That's a short term. But for a long term, you want a patient to go home and be more independent in the next 6 months or a year, based on what their health issue is. So it always depends on what you're doing and why you're doing it. Again, use short-term or long-term, and also include impact statement. When you start doing your work, you formulate an action plan. It's best to write things down and make a to-do list. I always like to include to-do lists, whether you're working on the floor as a nurse or as a whatever you're doing now, or staying home, making your grocery list. So next time you go to the grocery store, a list would be very useful. And I like to scratch things out, as it gives me a good feeling to do things and then just scratch them out, meaning they're done. It gives me a good visual. And your objectives need to be clear and, of course, measurable, as I mentioned. Target levels, again, like I mentioned with pain, if the patient is experiencing 8 out of 10, you want to bring that to a target of 1 or 2, and a time frame. And also the plan would include clear steps on advancing your project ahead. Here's an example of a blank. This is also in the book, a blank action plan. you have dates, you have the steps, you have who is responsible, who's assigned to it, and the actual completion date. And this is a very simplified version of it, of course. However, big projects, large corporations use much more complex software to manage projects like this. If it's a big project, then there is a lot more than just a spreadsheet or a table like this. There are dates, there are tasks, accountability, reports, all that kind of thing. All right, so for summary here, evidence-based practice, research, and quality improvement play a part, of course, in clinical decision making. We've beaten that horse to death. Strategic people, strategic individual, we have to include them in order to answer questions on a variety of issues, and we use multidisciplinary approach. Translational research, as I mentioned, has basic and we move some of that basic into the bedside, basic research into the bedside for actual adoption. Also, some of the characteristics of translational research kind of tell us where basic research, but population research and patient-oriented research have a big role in improving people's health in general. And these logic models, it helps us plan, implement, and evaluate. Logic models, we're not going to go back to those. The outputs or outcomes, these are the results of your any project you're involved in, or what we call deliverables. Those are unit of service or products resulting from the project. Not all research questions include a service or a product, but this is more in general because translational research also is not only used in healthcare, it's used in other businesses. You might see it on your social media page because just companies are analyzing in real time your movement, where you are, or what you're interested in, what you click on. These things are help them make decisions on the fly to deliver a product or a service to you. Always, outcomes should be measurable and reflect the change that occurs from the project process. Otherwise, if you are a CEO and what you're doing is not working and it doesn't have an outcome that is measurable and it shows in numbers what's going on, nobody will buy in. Logic models, again, how important they are, and they are necessary to implement our projects. And also day-to-day management of the logic model process. All of that goes into an action plan where your projects are managed and implemented and evaluated. And the action plan takes the objectives and outcomes to develop concrete measurements of them, meaning the action plan sets your activities, it sets your steps of reaching your goal in a very organized, very systematic way. This is it for now. I will stop here, and if you have any questions, I'll post this to D2L, and we'll discuss it further if you need. If you have questions, please use the Ask the Instructor. I always recommend that because it helps everyone see what's going on. Instead of answering a question for one person, everyone would probably, who's having the same question, would benefit from it. Until we see you again, be good and stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye.